Hello, world history students, and welcome to this screencast on the end of communism in Eastern Europe. This will also function to help us understand the end of the Cold War. As I'm recording this in June of 2020 for use in class on June 2nd, there are massive protests happening around the United States. And so it's interesting, coincidental that this screencast is about involves massive protests. So as we go through, I'll make a few references to that would or could allow students to make some other connections to what's happening now. Of course, these are very different situations. The United States has freedoms that did not exist in the communist countries, and I hope that we can keep those for a long time. So let's take a peek. When we talk about Eastern Europe as the subject, I'm talking both about what used to be the Soviet Union and is today 15 different countries, the largest of which is Russia, which part of which is in Europe, and then another five European countries. There are 5 to 8 European countries, kind of depending on where we define Europe. So we see these countries here. The countries in pink were part of the Warsaw Pact. They're called satellite nations, like satellites orbiting around the Soviet Union, because they weren't truly independent, but they did have local governments. So the communist leader in Poland was a Polish person, and same for Czechoslovakia and East Germany and Hungary, etc. So we're going to look at these places which are no longer communist. Right? So if you look at the pictures here, the Soviet economic system did not work. I mean, that's the main point of these. So in the bottom left picture, we see a bakery, except you'll notice there's not a lot of baked goods. And in the right, you'll see a department store, but there are goods, but there's not enough for everybody, and there's not enough service people. So there's big lines to get, what is in there. People would wait in line a lot. The communist system was able to, generally speaking, feed people, but only because they were exporting a lot of oil. And the countries that had been communists for less time, like, say, Poland, produced more food than places like the Soviet Union itself, which had been communist for longer. So the main problem was economic inefficiency. And that was mostly what inefficiency means is the amount that was produced given how much work went into things. Now, the Soviet Union was able to build some things like rockets. They had very good rockets, tanks, lots of tanks, and other kinds of military equipment. But making goods that people needed or wanted was not something that was ever working well. And over time, that led to less support for the Soviet system. This system also didn't allow people freedom of speech or freedom of press. People couldn't worship as they chose always. They were spied upon. People could be put in prison for opposing the government. And in addition to being wrong, these are things that led to dissatisfaction with the system. And over time, as people became more aware of freedoms that people had in other countries, they were less satisfied. And these two things kind of go together. Today in China, as an example, people don't have these freedoms either. But the Chinese economic system is delivering today in 2020 at least some economic growth and economic opportunities for many, if not all, people. And as a result, people are more willing to go along with the system. But as the Soviet Union began to fall apart, people had really neither rights nor the opportunity to prosper. What dissidence refers to is people who spoke out about the system. They are often imprisoned, but people also knew their work and it circulated. So there was a way that people were able to express dissatisfaction. And starting in the 1970s, that started to really grow. Okay? Then finally, in 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, a country that then bordered it or bordered the Soviet Union as it existed. And this war turned into something of a Soviet Vietnam, where Soviet soldiers there were dying, not in huge numbers, but fairly consistently without the war ever resolving itself. And the US was supplying the rebels against the Soviet army much in the same way that the Soviet Union, as part of the Cold War, supplied Vietnamese communists fighting against the United States. So all of these things led to dissatisfaction with the Soviet system. Mikhail Gorbachev, then, is an important person in this. You can compare him to Deng Xiaoping, who students learned about in the June 1st lesson on changes in China. Like Deng Xiaoping, Gorbachev wanted to make the Soviet system work better by introducing reforms to make the economy function a little more like a capitalist economy without completely giving up the power that the Communist Party had to control society and the economy. That was his goal, similar to Deng Xiaoping. Unlike Deng Xiaoping, there's two ways that he was different. One is that he did allow more freedoms. So the kind of brutal crackdown that Deng Xiaoping approved on people protesting in Tiananmen Square is not something that Gorbachev ever did. And he also allowed more freedom of press and free ideas. The other way that it's different is that it failed. Gorbachev tried to reform the system, and instead, while he was leader of the Soviet Union, it collapsed. And so that's the end of the Cold War then, because the US and the Soviet Union had been in competition. Fall of the Soviet Union meant that the US had won. Okay. So these are the years. That's the year I graduated from high school until the beginning of my second year of teaching. So this is very much part of my kind of young adulthood, these events. And so, as I mentioned, all right, the first reforms that he did were aimed at just trying to make the system less inefficient in terms of its most wasteful areas. So you can see this poster here shaming the loafer and the drunkard, where Gorbachev tried to decrease alcoholism. And this was, problem drinking that was cutting down on people's health and was also making people less effective at work. People were drinking at work. You have to kind of understand what it's meant here. And part of this is because alcohol was one of the few um, goods that people could get that wasn't strictly necessary. One of the few things that you could think of as like what we call consumer goods that people consume just for enjoyment. So vodka was available in a way that other things weren't. People had money, people had jobs, people had money. There just wasn't anything to buy. And one result of that was problem drinking. Gorbachev also tried to reduce military spending and did reduce military spending in two different ways. And these things were both popular with people outside of the Soviet Union. So again, I was in college at the time, and Gorbachev made us feel better because it made him being in power seemed to make war with the Soviet Union less likely, and so we were less afraid of that, because at the end of the Cold War, people were still afraid of nuclear war. So Gorbachev did this in a couple ways, and one that's important for this is that he stopped having so many Soviet soldiers in the Eastern European countries, and said that they had to keep the communist system in place themselves. So there were fewer Soviet soldiers in Poland and Hungary and Czechoslovakia and Romania and Bulgaria, those countries that weren't part of the Soviet Union but were communist. He also did this. Along with President Reagan, it takes two to make an agreement like this. And here they are, limiting its intermediate nuclear forces. So placing arms control on big weapons systems as a way to reduce the spending that the Soviet Union would have to make to stay caught up with the US in the arms race, which they were able to do, but at large cost to the rest of their society. In the US, in our capitalist system, the United States just ran a budget deficit to pay for all these weapons. But the Soviet system didn't quite work like that. And so it was real costly in terms of building these things. Okay. So Gorbachev then came through with three different reforms. And I'll leave these here for you to take a peek at. Actual Russians tended to, or other Soviet citizens, tended to kind of mix these, and they would use them to refer to all of the different things. But generally speaking, Gorbachev's goal was to make the Soviet system work better by having some market mechanisms, which means some ability for people to buy and sell things at prices that are not set by the government. So less communist, and that people could produce a little bit on their own, and then what they bought or sold, they would set the price of. And so it's an open market. So prices would change. People would have an opportunity to profit, and then they'd be more motivated to work harder. He wanted to do this with all of the business, they're not really businesses because they're part of the communist government, but all of the firms, the organizations that were producing things also that were run by the government, and have them try to make a profit by selling things for higher prices than what they paid to make the things. So that was the goal. And he knew that there would be people in the Soviet Union, like the people who profited or who had power in the old way, who didn't approve that. And so he wanted there to be freedom of expression and some democracy in order for the public to put pressure on the hardcore communists who didn't want to change the system. And he thought if people could speak out and if they could vote some, that then they would put pressure on the communist government that he was a leader of, that they would apply pressure to the people he was trying to direct to reform things in a way that would lead to more change. Now, this doesn't work out, and we'll kind of see why. But the idea was that people would speak out in favor of reform. And we'll kind of see why that doesn't work here. In this reading, which there'll be a question, you can pause and read this and then answer the question. A former member of the Communist Party talks about this. The first sentence here, it says, "It seemed to us," meaning communists, "that all we had to do was to remove some prohibitions," meaning take away some of the rules that kept people from being able to buy and sell goods more based on how much things actually cost, in an attempt to make a slight profit in order to make the system more productive. Okay. Give you a moment to read this and kind of see why that doesn't work. What happened is when people had a chance to speak out, instead of saying, well, this system's pretty good, Mr. Gorbachev, because Gorbachev he was still a communist. Like, he still thought that having the Communist Party lead a socialist society would create a better future. Instead of saying, we agree with you, we just need to make some small changes, instead people said, this system is awful and we need to get rid of it. So the criticisms that came when people had freedom to speak their mind a little bit were much more severe than what Gorbachev had predicted, I think. At least that's one way to interpret what happened. So we have evidence like this. So this is a poster here, and you can see Stalin in the top, and the artist is, making a strong claim that the whole system is rotten because it allowed a murderous leader like Stalin to control the country for a quarter century. So, what was then the impact of Gorbachev's reforms? Well, people made more demands. So, what you see here in this map are three countries that are on the Baltic Sea that were part of the Soviet Union, and people living in those countries demanded that they be independent from the Soviet Union. And in fact, in 1989, the same year as the Tiananmen Square massacre, and also the same year that the Berlin Wall came down later, in between those two events, a couple of 1 million people made a human chain. So there's human beings in a chain that over hundreds of miles that went along the line that's in the map here. And they're demanding independence for their country so that they can control their own affairs. It's actually a kind of decolonization, except instead of an overseas colony, it's the land empire of Russia / the Soviet Union that they're trying to break free from. The economic reforms that Gorbachev introduced did not solve the problems because the system was, at least it's hard to know for sure, but the evidence suggests that the system was in much worse shape than he thought. So Gorbachev wanted all the pieces of all the, like, say, factories and shops that made things in the Soviet Union to start to keep American style or capitalist style, British, other capitalist country style accounting. Like if you've taken accounting where there's like income and, there's income and outgo, like there's, money coming in, money going out. And then the idea would be that only the companies or the units that were turning a profit would stay open. So it'd be kind of like a free market. The problem was basically that they all failed. The system was so goofed up that nothing was able to make a profit or even like cover its expenses with what it was making. So the system melted down. And so now people could speak their mind and their lives were actually getting worse. Now, outside of the Soviet Union, people were a little bit puzzled by this because it seemed like Gorbachev was making life better. Because as Americans, we like freedom. People could speak out, they could make a giant human chain, they could fly different flags and do these things. But the reality is that was happening at the same time that people's lives weren't improving, so it just made them demand even more that they wanted to break away from the system. So we get other kinds of mass movements like this. Within 2 years, then, not only were the countries in Eastern Europe that had been controlled by the Soviet Union, they were not communist, like Poland, which you can see in this picture, but the Soviet Union itself had broken up into 15 countries. Now, it's worth kind of like making this comparison, and this is where kind of thinking about things that are happening in our country now, because there were also mass movements in China. There's these, thousands and thousands of people, like you learned about in the Deng Xiaoping's China lesson in Tiananmen Square, which is the largest public space in the world, had gathered together. Um, and initially, the troops sent there to make them leave had refused to do that. And so this is the key point, that social movements in like this time period are going to end either, in violence and slaughter, or they'll succeed if the security forces, I mean like police and in our case National Guard, army, um, allow the change to happen, or, this is the result that happened in China in 1989. Now, the protesters in Eastern Europe were inspired by this, as you learned about in Tank Man, and maybe they knew that the same thing wouldn't happen in their situation. But it is a real comparison, as we'll see. So this shows the breakup of the Soviet Empire, with the different kinds of green being the former Soviet countries and the different shades of yellow being previously communist states that became non-communist. And this is all in like 1989 through the mid 90s. So there were anti-communist movements in all these countries, and as they got more space to express themselves, they gained more power. And in fact, here you can see Solidarity, which was a union that was non-communist in Poland, how they are using the Tiananmen Square massacre as inspiration. So anti-Soviet propaganda and organizations started to grow. So comrade was a way that communists talked to each other, and this was a Soviet comrade leaving Hungary. So it's over means we're not going to be part of your communist organization anymore. Massive street protests in some of these places. And so this is in Czechoslovakia. Now, 21 years before this, the same thing had happened in Czechoslovakia, and the Soviet Union sent in tanks and killed, kind of like Tiananmen Square style, killed tons of peaceful protesters who tried to block off this big square with buses. But in 1989, under Gorbachev, he said that they weren't going to prop up the communist leaders in Czechoslovakia, and there weren't enough Czechoslovak, like local communist forces who were willing to massacre their own people. And so this peaceful protest was able to overthrow the government. And here's the first non communist president of Czechoslovakia. So I'll give you a second to pause and read this. But he's explaining why they didn't want to be communist anymore and why did so many people show up in that square. And then the most famous example is the Berlin Wall that had divided Eastern and Western Berlin, the communist and non communist parts. That came down. And again, people started leaving East Germany, and the border guards pretty much, at first there was some confusion, but then they decided, not like the actual guards themselves, not being supported and reinforced by the Soviet Union, or enough of their comrades decided not to massacre the people who were revolting. Now, this is on the West Berlin side, the free side. You can see they're smashing into it, but people from East Germany were able to leave, and the people dismantled the Berlin Wall over the course of, a pretty short time. If you're in Berlin now, you can barely see where it was. It's been removed. Okay. And then finally, in the Soviet Union itself, the end came with a big twist. So in 1991, August 1991, I remember this. I was getting ready to teach my second year of school, and I was in my apartment in California watching this on CNN. And there was an attempted coup. A coup is when people overthrow the government by force. And some military units were working with some communist leaders who didn't like Gorbachev. So they thought his changes had gone too far. Now remember, there's other people out there, like those protesters who we just saw, who thought his reforms didn't go far enough. This is Gorbachev's basic problem. To the hardcore communists who still were in the government and a lot of people in society, Gorbachev was a traitor. Like, he was dismantling, breaking the communist system. And to people who weren't communists, well, Gorbachev was a communist. He was part of the Communist Party. So even though he was well loved outside of the Soviet Union, he was not loved at all inside the Soviet Union. But here's what's happened. So hardcore communists tried to take over the government while Gorbachev was on vacation. So they rolled tanks into big cities, especially Moscow, the capital, which is recognizable with St. Basil's Cathedral back there. But unlike in Tiananmen Square, or like in Tiananmen Square the first time, the actual soldiers refused to just massacre people. And so when people didn't leave the streets and surrounded these tanks, the soldiers driving them eventually just got out of them and walked away, kind of came together with the protesters. And then new leaders emerged. So the hardcore communists who tried to overthrow Gorbachev, they were stopped. And so then new leaders. So in the middle here is Boris Yeltsin, and that's a Russian flag. And so he was the president of Russia. So if Gorbachev's not in control and the communists who tried to take over aren't in control, who is? Well, the leaders of the different parts of the Soviet Union, the biggest of which was Russia. So he then became the leader of Russia, Boris Yeltsin. He had been, but then the Soviet Union dissolved because each of the parts became an independent country. So if you see on this map here, Russia is the largest part of the Soviet Union by far, but then there's 14 other places, and 11 of them here are in the different colors, because those countries where they had the big human chain, they were already independent. So it broke up, and what used to be the Soviet Union for a time was something called the Commonwealth of Independent States. That's how they competed at the 92 Olympics. But today, those places are all their own independent countries. So in the end, massive street protests played a big role in overthrowing the communist government of the Soviet Union, in part because there was not enough support in the Soviet security forces, police and military, to massacre their own citizens. So that makes it similar to what happened in Iran, but different from what happened in China. All right. Thank you for listening. Um, I hope that this has made some sense. Well, we got a little circle there, and that you do well on the ed puzzle that goes with this if you're doing that assignment. All right. Good night.